The Herbalist's Journey, written and narrated by Adrian Lam. This is the story of my Chinese paternal grandfather, Park Lam, who was born poor, but through unbelievable luck became wealthy and privileged. He fought in 2 wars, worked for the Communist Revolution, and fled political oppression to find freedom and happiness. Park was born in 1925 on his father's fishing boat on Lake Pyongyang in China's Jiangxi province. He was a river rat, as the land dwellers called the local fishermen. Park was the eldest. He and his 4 siblings all lived and worked on his parents' small boat. It was a hard life with little money. If there was no catch that day, they went hungry. One day in 1937, when Park was 12, the gods, he says, smiled on the Lam family. My great-grandfather Wei took his boat into an unfamiliar part of the lake when the net became snagged. Park and his brother Chang dove into the water to release it. The brothers came to the surface with a small heavy box that, when opened on deck, would change their lives forever. The box was full of gold and silver coins, more money, Park says, than they would see in 1,000 lifetimes. Stunned at their good fortune, the boys dived for more treasure. They found 2 smaller boxes filled with coins, and an old suitcase with 2 silver candlesticks and a tea set. They dived until they were exhausted, but if the lake held more riches, it had sunk to the depths. Where did this fortune come from? When the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931, some of the wealthy there escaped by boat with their fortunes to safety in the south. But the usually calm waters of Lake Pyongyang are raging mountains in severe storms, and some of the boats sank. One man's bad fortune is another's good, Park says. My great-grandfather Wei decided to use the discovered treasure to buy a house and business on land and educate his children. But this was risky. The Japanese has invaded the north. Would they come south? Wei was illiterate in any illegal transaction. He could easily be cheated. He traveled to see his cousin Li, who was apprenticed to a herbalist in Jiangxi capital, Nanchang. He told Li of his good fortune and offered to reward Li if he helped him. A small restaurant and adjoining house nearby was for sale, and Li knew a trustworthy notary. He would help his cousin for 50% of the business. Wei was shocked at this demand, but Li was literate and smart and would be honest if given what he wanted. So the cousins brought the small restaurant and the 2 families moved into the rambling house behind the proper's business. Wei then turned his attention to his son's education. A schoolroom was created in the rooms above the restaurant, and a live-in tutor was hired. Park and his brothers began their intensive education. The hard old tutor drilled them day and night, and beat them when he was displeased. Park escaped when he could, to the herbalist shop that his father and cousin had also brought, and which Li now ran. Park was fascinated by Chinese herbal medicine and became a part-time apprentice in the store. The Japanese invaded Nanchang in 1939, and the families fled to safety further south. They returned after Nanchang fell, repaired their damaged home and businesses, and took up lives as best they could during the enemy occupation. Park's knowledge of herb medicine grew, and he wanted to study at the university. But early in 1943, age 18, he and Chang, age 17, secretly joined the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the communist forces battling the Japanese. For 3 years, the guerrilla fighters traveled across the country, leaving rough, striking at the enemy, blowing up their supplies, and fleeing into the hills to avoid capture. Park used his simple medical skills to help his wounded comrades. Near the end of the Japanese occupation, Chung was killed in combat. Park still carried a small splinter in his side of the grenade that exploded near them. When it aches, he said it's Chang talking to him. In 1945, the Japanese were defeated. Park went home to recover from his wounds and see his family, who had lost much of their wealth during the war. The restaurant and the house were razed by the fleeing Japanese. The herbalist shop has survived, but now both families lived in the crowded rooms above. The Chinese Revolution underwent a resurgence, and the communists took up their long, hard-fought war against the nationalists. After a year-long recovery, Park rejoined the PLA. He saw hard fighting and froze in the North's bitter winter as communists swept through the country, finally defeating the nationalist force. When the Civil War was over, Park became a so-called barefoot doctor. He was unqualified, but his knowledge and training meant he could join medical teams which traveled to remote regions, bringing help to poor villagers. He cut the decayed flesh from the unbound and deformed feet of old women, removed lumps from arms and legs, and reset poorly knitted bones. He was not a doctor of Western medicine. He was a traditional Chinese herbalist with simple surgical skills, but the people were grateful for any kind of medical treatment. In 1959, after traveling the country for nearly 10 years, Park settled in Shenzhen on the Pearl River, where he worked for a herbalist and studied at the university. He was an active Communist Party member and was outspoken at meetings during a time it was unwise to do so. Mao Zedong was China's absolute ruler, and going against the party was dangerous. Park denounced the policy of treating farmers as heroes and feeding them for free in state-run canteens, arguing the peasants would not plant their crops. His prediction proved true. Food shortages were increasing, and in the north, people were starving. Dissenters were being driven from the party. Some had disappeared. Despite having fought in the Civil War and all his medical work, Park knew his past followed him. He was an educated man of some privilege, and he was suspected of being a capitalist ruler. Park, walking in the street late one night, saw an old party comrade hurry across the street to avoid him. Park knew that prison or death soon awaited him. He didn't go home. He went to the docks to steal a boat to escape to Hong Kong, 30 kilometers away. But he was discovered and jumped into the freezing river. He was lucky there was no moon that night, concealed the dark water. He avoided the soldiers by hiding amongst the floating islands of garbage that clogged the river's mouth. He was in the icy water for hours, swimming and floating on the tide. Until near dawn, he washed up on the rocky shore of Kowloon. He wandered, semi-delirious, shivering with exhaustion and cold through the old walled city, until he saw a Chinese herbalist's sign. He called out weakly and collapsed at the door. The herbalist took him in, and he and his daughter May cared of Park, who nearly died from pneumonia. Park and May fell in love, and even though he was much older, they married and had 3 children. My father Patrick, their youngest son, was born in 1967. When May's father died, Park moved his family to Kowloon proper. With Park's savings and May's inheritance, they set up a Chinese herbal medical practice. Even though the communist cause he's devoted much of his life to had betrayed him, Park harbors no bitterness. He still believes strongly in social justice. He always took time out from his busy practice to help Hong Kong's underprivileged. He volunteered, bringing free medical skills to help the homeless and the so-called cage dwellers, the old, the poor, and mentally ill, forced to live in partitioned apartments, in spaces hardly big enough to sleep in. Park and May have long retired. They live 2 floors down from us in the apartment building, which overlooks the harbour Park swam through to safety 50 years ago. Whenever Park sees a whole fish on the platter, he tells me he thinks of his childhood days on the sampan, his parents' small boat, and of his family, who disappeared from Nanchang during China's Cultural Revolution. He hopes his siblings are still alive, somewhere. Park often talks of his unbelievable good fortune. The day they found the boxes of money. The money that changed his life. The money that gave him an education and brought the shop that gave him his love of Chinese herbalism and traditional medicine. Park's good luck has translated into his descendants' good fortune too. Without it, we might all have been poor lake fishermen, struggling to earn a living. Park's comfortable position in life meant he was able to send his children and grandchildren to university to help them achieve their dreams. Park is 96 now. He's almost blind, but his spirit is still strong. May is a sprightly 80-year-old. I visit them often and listen to Park's fascinating stories of his amazing life's journey. A life shaped by fortune and misfortune. A life shaped by great historical events. A life well lived. A life, as they say, for the ages.